Thank you. We'll move on to our next presentation, which was prepared jointly by Nicolas C. and Dries Lyna. But only Nick C. is going to present tonight. Nick C., not to be confused with Nick C. I've never met another one with the same name. Dries Lyna is a social and cultural historian of the 17th and 18th centuries, with special interest in civic institutions of the Low Countries and VOC, that is the Dutch East Indies Company, settlements in the Indian Ocean world. Trained at the Center for Urban History in the University of Antwerp. He has published on VOC institutions and social mobility in Colombo and Galle, Sri Lanka. He is interested in the family life of former slaves in the suburbs of Colombo as part of the projects Life After Slavery and Slavery, Forced Migration and Family History, collaborations with the University of Glasgow, to which he is project leader. Now, Nick C. here is assistant professor at the University of Philippines, Diliman. Currently on study leave, he's based at Radboud University, Nijmegen, where he's writing his dissertation under the supervision of Professor Dr. Yang Kok and Dr. Dries Lyna, a project that combines cultural, social, and demographic history approaches to describe an intertwining of colonial and local forms of slavery. His dissertation is an early modern history of Indian Ocean encounters in an archipelago that was a vital link connecting Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic histories of slavery. And the title of their work is today is Lives Caught on Paper, Colonial Registration in Luzon Prior to Bourbon Reforms. Nick C.
Thank you, Nick C. Okay, so just give me a moment as I set this up. Make sure I'm sharing the correct thing. Here we go. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for bringing us together and for offering Dries and I the chance to present our very early findings. Dries apologizes for not being here. He's currently on a research visit to Chapel Hill. I should say, for me, this and Alfonso about Pampanga, I wanted to ask Fray Erickson about the parish registers. So please treat these things as a work in progress. In this paper, we follow up on what the conference calls a powerful sense of plunder and loss linked with the British looting of Manila. And Dalrymple plucked the shelves of the Augustinian library empty, but even as he did so, the Augustinians continued to construct the Spanish paper empire elsewhere. And okay. And here is the case study that we mentioned in our abstract. On the 4th of November, 1762, Manila's Archbishop scrawled frantically to Simon de Anda that the antagonizing British would cause the destruction of Christianity in the islands. But that same day, in Lubao, half a day's march away, Fray Diego Noguerol, OSA, recorded the marriages of indios Nicolas and Maria in his parish register. Now, Fray Diego was Lubao's Augustinian prior. Lubao was the order's provisional headquarters at the time of the invasion. The question that I ask is why do this? The enemy is at the gates. What was at stake for all the parties in their continued construction of these registers? And our goal today is to talk about the everyday stakes of registration for ordinary people. Registration is typically viewed as any of several things. Number one, it was a top-down tool of social control. And even Michael Cullinan in his Accounting for Souls talks about the intrusive state, for instance. Number two, it was a quantitative abstraction of a historical reality. So these are what the demographers usually approach the registers with. Number three, the parish registers in the Philippine context are usually seen as a spiritual register for solely spiritual ends. Now, these are all partial things. Our paper's intervention is to also say that there's something else. Streator and Breckenridge, I'm covering the photo, but there it is, assert that while the work of Foucault and even James Scott and his Art of Not Being Governed talk about social control, registration was also about recognition. Registration was only successful if its subjects had a stake in inscription. So in this paper, we talk about both things. We talk about registration as a top-down tool of power and a bottom-up tool of recognition. And we are doing this discussion for a period earlier than is usually discussed for Philippine parish registers. The existing literature is very 19th century, and everything prior is treated as a brief prelude. Our main question is, what was at stake in registration? And we argue that the state's demand for tribute did create local preoccupations in the extension of state control. And this is well known for the 1800s. We're exploring the dynamic for the 1600s and 1700s. And more importantly, we are adding that registration was also used by local agents for their own localized non-state priorities. Now, before we flesh out this claim, I'm going to lay some groundwork. For the 1600s, 25 parishes have surviving registers, and they range from the 1620 registers of Panay in Rizal, which I frankly haven't seen. I know that they exist, but I have not seen them, to the 1699 registers of Haro in Iloilo. Two parishes, namely Lubao and Vigan, have marriage registers, and so far only Vigan has been identified to have burial registers. Now, Dries and I have received the funding to transcribe these registers, and work on that has proceeded with a small team of Dutch and Filipino student assistants. The placement of these registers on the map are as follows. They cluster in the area around Manila in the provinces of Bulacan and Pampanga to the north. However, this distribution has less to do with the age of these parish registers than the structural reasons linked to the survival of paper. Many old parishes are not on this list, and it is an insulation from natural and man-made disasters, from devastating typhoons and mortar raids and American bombs, that has led to the survival of these items. And one of the oldest of these registers is the one in orange there, that of Lubao, and we're gonna focus on its registers in particular. And if you've read the work of Matthew Furlong, his unpublished dissertation, and William Henry Scott, they've already explored snippets of this. I should be the first to say that I don't have roots in Pampanga or its language or the local history of Lubao. And this is something that I'm hoping I can, in conversation with Ian, work out. Nevertheless, it's useful to point out that Lubao and Pampanga as a whole, from the very early years of the Spanish conquest, closely tied itself to the colonial order bureaucratically, militarily, religiously, and people from Pampanga entered the ranks of these three domains within the first century of Spanish rule, not just in their province, but wherever the empire needed them. Now, we turn to the registers themselves, and the Council of, I'm just going to switch the slide in a moment, the Council of Trent's advice on the creation of the baptismal registers instructs parish priests to keep sacramental books, but only does so in the context of preventing repeat baptisms and preventing marriages with impediments such as consanguinity. However, both incidentally and systematically, these parish registers had other things at stake when overlaid with the goals of other actors and other contexts. And we'll discuss these concerns as they were linked to tribute. And then afterwards, we're going to talk about non-state concerns. So, okay. So first, fiscal concerns. Increasingly systematically, these registers were used for tribute purposes. And Luis Alonso tells us that by the mid-18th century, the archipelago's central government proposed a standard policy allowing indigenous municipal officials access to the parish registers. They counted their community's tributaries with the priests' cooperation. But this policy took time to develop. The 1680s present a different picture. In one case taken from the Residencias, a provincial fiscal asked the Dominican priest of Samal, in what is today Bataan, to turn over the town's baptismal registers so that the fiscal could count tributaries. Okay, so far so good. However, the Dominican refused. He argued that he would be happy to certify the number of tributaries in town, but if the indios got wind of the fact that he had turned over the baptismal register to a tribute collector, they would connect baptism to tribute collection, damaging their perception of the sacrament. This claim has echoes of the well-known rule that new converts not be charged tribute for the first 10 years since conversion, so as not to prejudice them against baptism. But that rule cannot be applicable in this instance because in this case, Samuel was clearly eligible for tribute. Eventually, the Governor General ordered the Dominican to turn over his parish registers. Now, the thing to note here is that the Dominicans' proposed alternative solution acknowledged the sacramental register's role in tribute collection. The Dominican did not deny the government that the government had right to access the data created by the parish register. He only protested that this right be exercised discreetly. Now, on this slide, this thing I have to work out, yeah? On this slide, we see tallies made on the margins of the registers. And elsewhere, we see mathematical equations. These tallies resulted in the collection quotas. In the case that I've just mentioned, the register is firmly in the hands of the priest as a colonial agent. And I think this is where the historiography's perception of registration as a top-down tool of power aligns with a broader tendency in colonial histories to make a distinction between what is top-down and colonial versus what is indigenous and grassroots. But I think the process was more complex than that. First, the indigenous subalterns also had a lot at stake in these collection quotas. The consultas of Juan de Paz advised that it is unjust to arrest indigenous leaders who are unable to meet the collection quotas. But the residentias from the first decade of the 1700s say that the prisons of Tondo were full of cabezas de barangay arrested for the same, some of whom had died in captivity. But more than having their freedom or their lives at stake, these indigenous subalterns also participated in the construction of these registers as a living document, or at least I suspect their hand behind the indigenous words Natiyaina, which means deceased, and patay, both of which noting the death of individuals on these registers. So now we move to the second part of this presentation, localized stakes. And here we'll talk first about the jurisdictional battles between religious orders and organization, Schumacher's History of the Church or his Revolutionary Clergy, De la Costa's Jesuits in the Philippines, Carolyn Brewer's Holy Confrontation, or Dr. Blanco's discussion of it this morning. These discussions usually revolve around petitions and personalities. What we have found is that in these battles, registers were also used in a discourse of priestly responsibility, so that in the 1680s, for instance, the Dominicans launched investigations against the Recollect missionaries in Zambales and against the secular clergy south of Makiling, and they accused these parties of falling short of their responsibilities. To support their accusations, they sent the Archbishop copies of the parish register, which had the alleged consanguineous marriages and baptisms conducted too many days after the child's birth. And the Dominicans won both cases, and they won jurisdictional ownership of those territories for themselves. And finally, we have the parish register used as a document to determine enslavement. And I caution here that this was not the original intention with which these registers were made. My claim here after that is also a hypothesis, I have to stress. We argue that the parish register also functioned as a proto-slave register because in the 1680s, after a century of prohibition against enslavement of the indigenous, one of the last and most effective prohibitions by the king was challenged by multiple petitioners. The religious orders acknowledged that the king's instructions were valid for indios orientales, were valid for indios occidentales because they were his vassals, However, these religious orders argued the instructions should not be valid for indios orientales. Now, these terms reference the Pope's dividing line, cutting the world in two between the Portuguese and the Spanish monarchies. The indios occidentales were the indios of the Philippines. The indios orientales here were slaves purchased through the Portuguese slave trade connecting South Asia with the Philippines. And importantly, appended to this petition was another petition, this time by the indigenous elites, that clearly related the likely petition by the indigenous elites that made the clearly related but likely false claim that all the slaves they owned were in fact descendants of indios orientales, and thus inherited the enslavement of their grandparents. Now, we're missing key bits of evidence. We're missing the specific use of the parish register to make that claim. However, I do think it is likely. One, when the racial origins of the 17th century abogado Nicolas Herrera were contested, his baptismal entry was used as proof to show that he was the son of indios. Two, the parish register often noted enslaved status. And from a religious standpoint, enslaved status was recorded because enslaved parents could not be responsible for their children, and so it was the slave owner who bore that responsibility. However, from the standpoint of recognition as sought by colonial subalterns, we suspect that the parish register doubled as the slave register, on which one could prove that one's slaves were legitimate due to their descent from slave mothers. It's interesting to note that when these parish registers were rewritten in 1769, because what happened is that the Lubao parish registers were rewritten at some point. So this is the original in 1761, and beneath it, you've got its rewriting. Some 100 years later, the category esclavo on this rewriting was dropped, suggesting, as Scott says, that the era of slavery had indeed passed and that this detail was no longer necessary. Now, to close our essay, we go back to the couple at the altar, inscribing their marriage amidst the invasion of the British. What was at stake? We've argued that the stakes were multiple and that they were held not just by the people on top exercising social control, but also by subalterns with their own localized priorities. From the perspective of everyday life, the register was not just a colonial instrument, but instead was embedded in the everyday priorities of historical agents to look at the parish register, yes, but also to look at the progressive afterlives of this document as inscription moved further and further away from its original goal. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to leave you with this slide. And I asked myself, was this an act of idleness, this just drawing around the names of these individuals? Or if we should perhaps see this act, even in idleness, as an effort to make the mundane meaningful. So that's our presentation. Thank you for listening.